Welcome to Economy Disrupted. I'm Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS. Delighted to have you with us for episode 6. Today we're going to talk about debt, the U.S. fiscal trajectory before and after COVID. We've got a special guest today who Stephanie will introduce in a second. Let me say, as you're watching, you can submit questions at the link below, and we look forward to hearing from you as well.
I'm Stephanie Segal, Senior Fellow with the Economics Program at CSIS and co-host of Economy Disrupted. Thanks for joining us today for episode 6. We've got about 45 minutes with our guest, and then we're going to wrap up just after 3 o'clock with a short segment called The Bottom Line. So we hope that you can stay with us until the end. For today's guest, we're very happy to be joined by Maya MacGuineas, President of the nonpartisan nonprofit Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, an organization that's dedicated to educating the public and working with policymakers on fiscal issues. Maya, thanks for joining us and welcome to Economy Disrupted.
Thanks, it's great to be with you both.
So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and judging by audience questions thus far, there's a lot of interest in this topic. So we're going to talk, as Matt mentioned, about the fiscal path and fiscal government debt burden facing the United States, both pre and post COVID. So it's hard not to focus kind of on the here and now with the discussion on Capitol Hill right now about the next relief package. But I think it would be helpful if you could give us a sense for the debate pre-COVID and pre-kind of current crisis on the trajectory of fiscal policy and the trajectory of government debt in the United States.
Okay, great. I love putting that question that way because I think there's really 3 parts to this story in terms of fiscal policy, which is where were we before the crisis? What do we need to be thinking about during the crisis? And where does this leave us / what do we have to do about it after the crisis? And of course, this moment is a terrible, in some ways, I think we're even becoming numb to how just crazy and devastating this moment is, both in health and economic, and that should not be lost in all of this. But the story on the fiscal front starts beforehand. And the situation was that following the crisis of 2008, 2009, we built up the debt relative to the economy to very high levels. And normally what one would do, or one would make the case you should do, is that once the economy recovered and was strong enough again, we'd want to bring that debt as a share of GDP back down. The deficits came down as the economy started to recover. The debt as a share of GDP never got as far as coming down. But in the midst of that record-long expansion, we actually started building up the debt again. And this came from a number of policies: unpaid for tax cuts, followed by unpaid for spending increases, plural, followed by more unpaid for tax cuts. And all told, in the last years of the economic expansion, Congress passed and the president signed $4.7 trillion in new borrowing at the time when you would have wanted to see that debt coming down. So we entered this moment with the debt relative to GDP, the highest it has ever been in this country, in the entire history of the country, other than right after World War II. And there are a lot of reasons you care about the debt, but one of them is so that you have it as a fiscal tool. You have it in a healthy situation, so as a fiscal tool, you can use it to fight moments just like this. So the problem is we entered this moment dangerously unprepared. And even before this moment, not only were debt levels really uncharacteristically high, they were twice as high relative to the economy as they had been when we entered 2008 downturn. And they are twice as high, this was at 80% of GDP, twice as high as the historical average in this country. But it wasn't just that the levels were bad, and they were troubling. The trajectory was also really quite bad, with the debt growing faster, projected to grow faster than the economy every year forever. And at that point, we were assuming that we would hit about 100% of GDP in about 2030. Now, just to show a little bit about how the deterioration has grown so much, we will now hit 100% of GDP probably today, if we haven't already. We are right in the moment where we're doing this. So this has sped up that already very dangerous trajectory where the debt's growing faster than your overall economy, which is the definition of unsustainable. We sped that up by decades. And again, that's why you don't want to enter a moment so over indebted, because you want to have the fiscal space where you're not going to leave the emergency with such high debt levels. We will leave this, by next year, we will break the record and we'll be at the highest level we've ever been of debt compared to GDP.
So lest the viewers think that we're just going to kind of leave things on that kind of terrifying note, we actually are going to get to some questions about what one does about that. But before we get there, and I do want to kind of acknowledge the moment that we're in right now and the response to the pandemic and the fiscal packages that we've seen to date in response. Now, you testified, Maya, it was last week or the week before Congress, and called the initial spending packages passed by Congress in response to the pandemic an overall success. And so I wonder if you could, given the answer to the last question, kind of this precarious situation that we're in, can you explain a bit the characterization of the spending packages being an overall success given that backdrop?
Yeah, exactly. So regardless of the fact that I think how we entered this moment was reckless and irresponsible and reflective of a broken political situation and a broken fiscal policy set of tools, we are doing exactly what we should and have to be doing at this moment, which is borrowing. And as somebody who is, not a huge fan of borrowing when you shouldn't be doing it, there are times when you absolutely need to borrow. National emergencies and huge economic contractions, and that is where we are. And so borrowing is exactly the right thing. And I think the most dangerous thing we could do right now, other than foolish things regarding how we're handling the healthcare crisis, would be to stop borrowing prematurely. That would have devastating effects on the economy. So what we did, I think what we needed to do was kind of build packages that met the 3 T's of fiscal policies during emergency moments as best they could. Those 3 T's being temporary, timely, and targeted. And Congress, in a rare bipartisan effort, was able to put together some bills that just put trillions of dollars out into the economy, which is what we needed to be doing, certainly. So far, we have a tool which I hope is useful to people. I find it really useful, but that tracks everything that we've done so far to get money into the economy. And it looks at the legislative actions, the administrative actions, Federal Reserve actions. And just on legislative, we have approved $3.7 trillion to go into the economy, and 2.2 of that has already been dispersed or committed. The deficit impact of it will actually be significantly less. We are estimating about $2.4 trillion because a lot of that money will be paid back. Administrative actions are smaller, but there are about $400 billion that have been dispersed already. And the Federal Reserve actions, which are massive and unprecedented, so far about $5.8 trillion has been approved. 2.2 trillion of that has gone into the economy. And the reason that this was the right thing to do is a lot of that was targeted to healthcare, which is probably the most important, most productive place to target this money. A lot of this was targeted to alleviating hardships, which is where the payments to individuals and expansion in unemployed insurance and other things that were helping families that lost their income or were hit by the pandemic came into play. And then a lot of those things, which is trickier but critical, were targeted to try to keep the economy ready to recover as soon as we were able to open the economy back up, right? We shut the economy down. This is different than any other downturn we've had, certainly in modern times, where we basically turned the economy off. And what we wanted to do was keep things ready to reopen, which is why we had so many business loans targeted basically as bridge loans till the recovery happened. And I do think that was the right thing to do. I think despite the fact that we've seen massive contractions in GDP, we've actually seen an increase in income. And that is a staggering fact right there, that we got more money into people's pockets. Much of that has not been spent. Much of that has been saved. So people are actually building up a little bit of a cushion. Hopefully not needed, but there's a big chance that there's a downturn this fall, right? If we have another round of things getting worse. So that hopefully helps prepare families a little bit more. I think the best benefit of what we did so far was the timely. We got it out incredibly fast. Now, of course, that leads to mistakes, and there were many. And we will see the headline stories of PPP loans that went to places they shouldn't have gone, benefits going to dead people. None of that is something to be proud of. As an organization that is concerned about government waste and inefficiencies, you cringe every time you see it. But despite it being the headline of a lot of stories, it's not the big picture story. The big picture story is Congress was able to approve trillions of dollars into the economy that, despite massive contractions, kept things overall, writ large, going relatively well. And of course, we'll have to think about the next packages. I guess one thing I'd say about and thinking about the next packages is while timely was kind of the T that dominated the first round, we now have the ability to think more about targeted. Where will those dollars make the most sense, have the highest returns, multiplier effects, and be most consistent with the kind of downturn this is? We used to not know how long this was going to last. I think it's now become painfully clear it's going to last longer than we were thinking or hoping in the beginning. And so you want to tailor make a lot of your response for the kind of recession it is. Interesting, sort of as a side note, before this all happened, our organization put out a paper called Break the Glass. And it said, we know we're going to have a downturn. We've had the longest economic expansion in modern times. There's going to be a downturn. When we come to put stimulus measures in place, because we're so weak fiscally, we should pair those short-run stimulus borrowing with long-term offsets. So you put in place expanded unemployment insurance benefits, but you pair them with longer-term reforms to the unemployment insurance system, just for instance, so that you would actually have built in a plan to bring the debt back down later. And when we were doing this exercise, we had this discussion of, should we spend time thinking about what the recession is going to look like in different scenarios for different recessions? And we, in hindsight, wrongly said, oh no, most recessions are sort of similar in how they play out and the characteristics of them. And just could not have been more wrong, because this is so unique in so many ways, where you've heard lines before in a recession where the president will come out and say, the best thing you can do is go spend, keep the economy afloat. Like this time, no, stay at home. Don't run out to the malls. And it's terrible to see malls closing, but we don't want to encourage people to go to malls. So it's a very, very different structure of the downturn, and that requires different thinking about the recovery packages. And we now have had more time to put those together. I'm not convinced we used that time well, and we are now running out of time as we bump up against things like deadlines. We missed the end of the fiscal year for most states. We missed the end of the expiration of the $600 that's been added to unemployment insurance in order to try to bring people up to 100% of their pre-job loss earnings. So those deadlines are being lost. But we had plenty of time to make the next package more targeted. That would have been time well spent to do that.
Let me play devil's advocate. Actually, the answer you just gave about the COVID situation, notwithstanding, or that is, that you've acknowledged that this spending and the buildup of debt is appropriate at a time like this. But your basic concern that you started with about debt, what's the worry? We're a big country that can issue debt in our own currency. This has been a problem for a long time. It hasn't caused a crisis yet. Other countries seem to like to put their money. They think we're a safe place to invest in. So why worry?
Yeah, so many answers to that question, though. It seems to be a question a lot of people, particularly politicians, like to ask right now. Because first, let's be honest, nobody likes fiscal responsibility. It's the spinach of policy making. I spent years working in think tanks where my friends and colleagues would come up with great ideas, great plans for tax reform or education policies or new healthcare programs. And I'm always the person who comes in and says, how are you going to pay for that? And that's the least welcome answer to anything. Not because it's not interesting and useful policy. It's actually really important and fascinating from the policy perspective, but obviously politically, one of the biggest divides between the two parties is their willingness to pay for things. And frankly, Republicans who say they want spending cuts, to generalize, and Democrats who say they want tax increases to pay for their various things, neither of them even really want that. The easiest thing is to be able to borrow, not have any of the policies that force trade-offs. So fiscal responsibility is not particularly popular. Therefore, it is not surprising that we see on the left and the right all sorts of arguments from, don't worry, these tax cuts are going to pay for themselves, which we can go in a deeper dive in this, but the tax cuts that we passed a few years ago never were going to pay for themselves and haven't come close to paying for themselves. And that's not because we were hit by this emergency. They weren't going to pay for themselves. They weren't going to come close. Tax cuts can grow the economy, but they don't come anywhere close to growing it enough to offset the lost revenue. Likewise, I'm very concerned about the arguments on the other side that are growing, which include everything from the MMT arguments of don't worry because if you borrow in your own currency, you can't default. Default is not the only risk, to now you're seeing like tax cuts pay for themselves. It's going to be mirrored on those spending programs will pay for themselves. All of this is to avoid the unpleasantness of fiscal responsibility. The reason it matters because despite remarkably and stunningly low interest rates, you can still experience crowding out. It's not nearly as big a concern as it used to be, but the studies that have been out there show that there is crowding out in the economy already. More troubling, though, I think, is the way that a high debt level leaves you so vulnerable. In my mind, I was just giving my kids a talk about, my teens, about how what you always want to do is have plan Bs. If something doesn't work out, you want a plan B. Perfect moment for kids to be learning about the need for plan Bs in this crazy world. And I feel like the US is leaving itself unable to implement our plan Bs more and more by being so spent fiscally. So our ability to, our dependency on low interest rates and borrowing right now is something we couldn't change. If any situation changes, we could not quickly snap into actually paying for our own bills. We're quite dependent on borrowing. We're quite dependent on borrowing from abroad. In fact, about 40% of our debt comes from overseas. Our lending comes from overseas. If interest rates were to go up, just a 1 percentage point increase, I think would lead to, it's about $200 billion, I might have my numbers wrong, $200 billion in increases in interest payments in 1 year alone. That's more than most of our major spending programs. Like, we're so vulnerable to changes in the economy. We are so vulnerable to changes in the demand for our treasuries. This is what I worried about a lot before this moment, we are in the midst of the fastest changing economy any of us have ever been through. First from changes due to globalization, now from changes due to technology. Just take technology. There's so many things we should be doing to prepare our economy for one where the future of work is going to be very different than what it is now, where automation is going to be changing jobs, our attachment to the workforce, all of these things. And yet our budget, which is both filled with too much borrowing and filled with too many commitments we've made in advance, right? We've made many promises in the future, everything from Social Security and Medicare to non-tax benefits in the pension area. And so we've locked ourselves into all of these areas of the budget when what we need more than anything is budget flexibility. We massively need a social contract for the new economy, which we are entering into. Yet we haven't even had a serious conversation about that as a nation because our resources are predetermined and we're over indebted. So I think opportunity costs and the vulnerabilities, both economically, social contract wise, and geopolitically, and in terms of national security, are all huge. And then lastly, there's fiscal space, which is we're able to borrow with no problems right now. But the more one takes advantage of that benefit, kind of recklessly like we do instead of responsibly, interest rates were cheap, were low, and so we were hearing the argument all over the place, we should borrow for this and this and this and not pay for it. It's basically free. First, I should say when interest rates are low, nothing is free. It just means you're delaying the cost. You're shifting the cost to somebody else. $1 trillion borrowed today means somebody's repaying that $1 trillion. It's just the time that you borrowed it, your interest payments are quite low. But the more you make the argument that you should borrow to pay for things, one, the lower the growth effects of those things are. It's not as good for the economy. But two, the more you get rid of that privilege that we have as a currency right now is, you start to push other currencies. The more indebted we become, the more you'll start to hear this discussion of euro, Chinese currencies, cryptocurrencies. Like, there will be more and more discussion about how long the US will hold on to its position the more we don't act responsibly with that advantage that we currently have.
Well, there's so much to follow up on. I have a follow-up question, but we've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'll try to fold my follow-up into a later question after Stephanie takes the baton here. So
sure, yeah, there was a lot in your answer to follow up on. This idea, especially in a market economy, that the market would discipline behavior, whether it's private sector or public sector borrowing behavior. And the disciplining here would be that the more you accumulate debt, the higher the debt burden goes, that interest rates would rise, and that would be an incentive to get your borrowing under control. We haven't seen that, as you've pointed out. We're at record low interest rates, not just in the United States, but everywhere. That's a function of very accommodative monetary policy in response to this crisis. But there is a lot of discussion about, has that accommodation gone too far? Has the commitment by central banks, including the Federal Reserve, to purchase assets to keep those borrowing rates low, if that might have a downside to it? So what's your thinking on the role of central banks in facilitating this very accommodative climate for countries to continue to borrow?
Yeah, it's a great and complicated question. Here is what I think. I think in many ways, fiscal policy put monetary policymakers in a terrible position over the past decade of not fulfilling the responsibility of doing our budgets and our tax and spending policies in sensible ways. There's actually more pressure that's been on the Fed. I think in this emergency moment, the Fed pulling out every tool it has and inventing new ones is the appropriate response, but it is not without risk. And so it is the situation where if your house is on fire, but it also needs restructuring in the bottom, needs a foundation, you've got to put the fire out first, but then you have to rebuild the foundation. And there is a risk that your foundation will collapse. And so that is what we have now, which is, I have no issues with the fact that the Fed is taking extraordinary measure after extraordinary measure and intervening in ways that it wouldn't have before, and purchasing massive amounts of the debt and ensuring that interest rates are low, because that helps tremendously in the moment. But it also creates a dependency on low interest rates. It enables policymakers to act like the fiscal situation isn't that bad, and it leaves us increasingly vulnerable to everything in the future, from different macroeconomic conditions where there's inflation or there's higher interest rates or changes to our currency, or a politicizing of the Fed, right? You want to make sure that the pressure, which will grow on the Fed, isn't able to successfully capture the Fed instead of keeping it as the very important independent institution it is. So I have no criticisms whatsoever of the things we've done. We have to attend to the crisis at hand. It's the same reason I'm okay that we are borrowing trillions of dollars that put us into unprecedented territory. But anybody who thinks that there's a guaranteed soft landing from any of this isn't paying attention to the mounting risks. And the problem is, the more vulnerable you are when you go into something, the more vulnerable you will be as the things continue to deteriorate. And that's where we are now. And it just feels like a very scary moment where we may someday look back and say, God, why weren't we smarter ahead of time? So I wouldn't want to be working at the Fed now seems like an incredibly complicated place to be. It would be a fascinating thing to be doing scenario planning for. It must be very difficult to figure out how to balance all those risks. But this is what we need to do right now.
Well, and if I could just follow up before passing back to Matt, you'd mentioned kind of the linkage here to the dollar, and obviously macroeconomic policies, both fiscal and monetary, do influence currency values. Could you just elaborate a bit on what you mentioned about, the dollar kind of now experiencing some pressure? I'm not sure if I'm repeating your words correctly or not, but what is the linkage then between kind of our fiscal and monetary posture and dollar valuation and the role of the dollar in the world?
Well, I should say, I don't think we're going to see a decline in the importance of the dollar in the short term. I think it was Sebastian Malaby's article that I read where he likened it to network effects, so that the situation with the dollar is somewhat like the network effect in tech companies, which I thought was an excellent comparison, where because so many transactions are denominated in dollars, everybody needs them. You need them more and more. It's the same as with tech companies, where the more people you have on any one platform, the more valuable that platform becomes. And so I think the dollar's unique position is pretty well cemented for the moment. But if we continue to have all sorts of imbalances and borrow to an extent where it becomes vis-a-vis the other options more risky, and there is more pressure to diversify, which there will be. And if that continues, the dollar's not going to be the safe haven, the reserve currency forever, not the sole one, but it seems as though it will hasten that change in a way that this country will be giving away an advantage that makes things pretty easy. But we've kind of used that advantage to be irresponsible instead of to make things easier.
Yeah, and with currencies, it's always a question of, well, relative to what? And I guess it's this question of how are other countries managing the health crisis and the fiscal and monetary response relative to the US, and that will tell us maybe something about the direction of the dollar.
Agreed. And we've always, every time we've been really concerned before, those concerns haven't ended up to be lasting. The dollar has kind of stayed strong, made it through. But obviously there are a lot of questions right now. We saw there was just the recent, the downgrade, not the downgrade, but the note from Fitch about, there's all sorts of instabilities, our healthcare situation, our debt situation, our political situation. Nobody's clearly looking better than us, but we are not increasing in anybody's eyes as a more stable place. And so you don't want to be the reserve currency because everybody's worse than you. You want to be the reserve currency because you've earned it from your own stewardship of the country. And I don't think we can say that that's the reason we are right now.
No, certainly it would be hard to defend that. But on the other hand, if we're going to be that sort of strong place that folks want to invest in and have confidence in, including in our currency, that we do have to make investments in things that we need to support our overall economic growth and future trajectory. And actually, that was the follow-up question I was going to ask was that Larry Summers was our first guest in this series, and Stephanie asked him about debt, and his answer was he's sort of dismissive and saying, it's kind of an accounting construct if you're talking about, treasury bills as the measure of debt, because if you think about not investing in our decrepit infrastructure, or not, funding government workers' pensions, or not doing a whole bunch of other things today that we need to invest in order to prepare for the future, then we're putting a debt on future generations of another kind. And so, I guess, how would you answer that? But then let me just, if I can just kind of seg into other questions about spending priorities, because there are lots of other things beyond Larry's list and COVID that people are calling for us to spend money on, whether it's, you could take Vice President Biden's plan, his economic plan, which has, collectively, I think, trillions of dollars to spend on R&D, on the caring economy, on various other things. Or you have Republicans now even calling for industrial policies to compete with China, which, again, when you add it all up, could be hundreds of billions of more dollars. Each of these things seems kind of legitimate and worthwhile, and you could make a strong case for any one of them, but collectively they are big investments. So how do you set priorities, and how do you balance all that out?
Wow, you jammed almost as much in that question as I can do in my answers. Okay, let me see.
Take a piece of it.
Well, there are a ton of good questions, so let me try to address as many as I can. Your first point about investments and people who make the case, Larry's making the case and others, that we need to be investing, 100% agree. We have underinvested in this country to a dangerous extent for decades. I think putting money into infrastructure is different than putting money into pensions. One is you're putting money into an investment that's going to increase your GDP. The other is putting money into somebody else's consumption so that responsibility doesn't fall on you. But it's actually a great illustration of how almost anything you think of has a benefit. I mean, there's a ton of things that we can and should think about spending money on that are all attractive. The question, this goes to your second point, is really about the trade-offs. But first, just in terms of the investment, we absolutely favor consumption in this country over investment. And that reflects a short-termism that we see in our government, in our business sector, in our thinking about almost all of these challenges that I think leave us dangerously vulnerable. It's a short-termism that we think about the debt. And we need to shift our budget so that we have much more money put into investment and less in consumption, I would say. And most people tend to talk about infrastructure. My big issue is human capital. I think we are just doing ourselves no favor by not investing in everything from pre-K, much better at education. Maybe it's just having been home with the teens, watching them do their online education this spring, but I think we're all a little terrified about, the level of education. But also, I'd throw in things like lifelong learning. Nobody should be under the illusion that you can stop your education at 18 or 22 or even 25 anymore. We are going to need to be learning through our entire working careers. Otherwise, we are going to become obsolete in a matter of years. So human capital is the big one for me. That said, investment can be paid for. When one looks at the studies of the returns, the economic growth that comes from investment in infrastructure, for instance, you have higher growth if you have a plan to pay for that infrastructure spending or investment than if you borrow for it. Because when you borrow and you increase the debt, that has a depressed effect on economic growth. And the problem isn't that, oh my gosh, we can't pay for these things. It's that we stopped being willing to. We no longer have a culture where it's even acceptable to discuss paying for something. My sort of simple bumper sticker, my real bumper sticker would be, let's put the debt on a downward path relative to GDP, which would be the worst bumper sticker anybody's ever seen. But my second favorite bumper sticker would be, if it's worth doing, it's worth paying for. And we've lost that. Again, I think because of the polarized political environment, where it is a competition to give away more things for free. But sometimes if somebody says, I think we should do this, I think pick any priority, something on infrastructure, and somebody else says, okay, we should pay for that. How are we going to pay for that? We can raise taxes. We can get spending over here. People will call that almost a poison pill. And it's as though the notion that you would pay for something has become so out of vogue that merely suggesting you'll think about what you attach to pay for it is seen as stopping it dead in its tracks. That is wrong. That has to be changed, and we will not change it unless we start forcing ourselves to confront those trade-offs. That goes to your second question, which is, all of these things sound good, and how do you figure out whether they are worth it? In an environment where some people want a much smaller government, some people want a much larger government, we at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget are agnostic to that question. We just want a government that you pay for it when it makes sense to, not in the middle of a pandemic, but when you're in normal times that you pay for, rather than borrowing and shifting those costs into the future. We need a budget process that forces those trade-offs. We're very into budget tools, and right now we have just one that's just called Is It Worth It? And it just looks at any priority out there on the tax or spending side, and then you can calculate, you can see how much is that in a cost per person, per family, or per taxpayer. It's not how the policies would actually go out because you have distributional choices you could make, but it just shows, you should think about the cost of something, because even if you're borrowing, it's not free. You're pushing that cost onto somebody else. So I believe, first and foremost, transparency in the cost of things in a ways that make sense, because billions and trillions don't. But second, in a way where the process actually requires you deal with those trade-offs. And so you actually should pick a fiscal goal. Let's say we're in recovered times. You pick a fiscal goal where your debt to GDP is 100% and it's headed towards 110%, but maybe you put out debt targets that say we're going to actually let it only get to 103% and then start to bend that curve back down. And then you have a budget that has to meet that target. Right now, we have no fiscal targets in our budgeting, and so you can borrow infinity. There's the debt ceiling, but that's kind of a weaponized game at this point that we should reform and replace with something else. But we should think about how you put in targets, and then you choose, would you rather have lifelong learning or pre-K or more defense spending and or higher taxes? Like, you have to link them to the choices and the costs, and then we could make more reasonable budget choices. I personally am somebody who in earlier years would have preferred a smaller government than the one we were headed towards. And now, as we have failed to make a lot of changes, think we'll have to have a significantly larger government, both to reflect the aging of the population, new risks around the world, of which I think there are many, and the underinvestment that's taken place for a long time. Different moments call for different sized budgets. To me, it's not, I'm a political independent, it's not an ideology, it's a what do we need at the moment. And I think you need a smart government, but I think you need one that meets the needs. We have a lot of needs right now. But people will differ on that. And my point of view is no better than anybody else's. What you need is a budget process that allows us to reconcile those priorities in a way that doesn't always say, let's borrow and push that bill onto somebody in the future. That's the one answer that seems to reflect no constituency other than the ones that have no voice.
Well, again, there's a lot there. I know Stephanie wants to cover one other important area, so I'll pass it back.
There's one topic, and I will say in your incredibly thorough and fantastic answers, you're actually getting at a number of the questions that we've gotten in from the audience. So I feel like we're doing our duty and covering some of the audience questions. But you also mentioned something on investment in human capital, which got at another issue that I wanted to make sure we covered with you. And that's this idea of fiscal federalism, the idea that there is some degree of transfer from the federal government to states and localities. And then a question about what is the right amount for that sort of transfer. In the case of education, that's usually the majority of public education is funded at the local level. There's a debate actually ongoing right now about the amount of support that should be provided to the states. And I think there's a pretty big gap between where Republicans and Democrats are on that particular question. So what's your view on this balance between federal spending and support and what the states and localities are responsible for? And how well are the existing mechanisms working for transferring resources to the states?
Okay, see now your questions, all of you guys are getting more and more things packed in there as well. You're doing the same trick.
Spending the time of this, right?
We've only got 45 minutes. We got so much to ask. Go ahead.
Okay, to try to unpack that a bit. So there's the relationship between the federal government and the states, both during a downturn like right now and in normal times. Let's take the downturn first. Moments like this, I think the plan that we have where states really can't borrow so much, and it's incumbent on the federal government to do the borrowing to even out the business cycle and distribute that to the states. I think that makes sense. The warning label I have to put on everything I say is anything that makes sense only makes sense if your government works. And as deep as my concerns about the debt are, they don't compare to my concerns about the dysfunction and division in our political system right now, because we can't seem to do anything. We can't seem to remember that we're one country with overall shared goals, despite having a bunch of different policy preferences. So I worry about that. I worry about negotiations being hijacked. I worried about people always negotiating as though it's adversarial instead of trying to do things right. But I think the model of the federal government borrows now and provides money for the states, and that the states have more flexibility in figuring out how those dollars are used. Right now, because different states have different situations with the pandemic and where their needs are, and in general, because government can work better when you're closer to the actual place where it's working, so you know how to implement things with some flexibility. I believe that tends to make sense. I also think I think the concerns about bailing out the states are legitimate, and many states have been quite responsible with rainy day funds and other things. Many states have not. But this isn't really about bailing out the states and irresponsible pension policies, for instance. This is about the fact that states' revenue the bottom has dropped out because of this, and it had to. And so we have to provide money to the states. Otherwise, there are going to be huge layoffs and furloughs, which exacerbate the situation. I think it is perfectly legitimate to tie a lot of that money to say, in the future, 5 years from now, we expect you to have updated your unemployment insurance system so we never have to go through the disaster that this has been in trying to have these systems talk to each other and be coordinated and have the right information and know who's alive and who's not. Like there's all sorts of different pieces of this that we have got to upgrade and update. On the bigger picture, there's differences on federalism just like there is on size of government. But I do think there's a problem that people think taxes can never be raised at the state, so they always look to the federal government to raise the money and give it to them. To me, that's 50 governors saying, I don't want to do the hard work of budgeting either. And I think it makes sense to have some flexibility in terms of some states are going to be high tax, high spend, and others will be low tax, low spend. That reflects the preferences of the states. But I think there's some things that are too important to leave. There's some things where there is a core level that we should agree on as a country. This is, again, just my preference. But one of the biggest concerns I have is our level of spending, how low the ratio of spending on people over 65 to those under 18 is something that really concerns me. It's more than $6 for every person over 65 for every one somebody under 18 at the federal level. That to me does not reflect the priorities of a country that is building a sustainable, resilient nation and economy, and that is a underinvestment in human capital, no matter how you look at it. And that includes if you bring in the dollars for the state and local. So I think that we would be wise to rethink what things do take place at the federal level and the state level. And I think this moment where we've seen such different responses from the governors and the president, and it's been a real thoughtful time for how federalism should work, opens up a great opportunity to do some of that rethinking.
You know, there's so much more that we would like to ask, but I'm conscious of the time here, and we promised our audience that we'd let a couple of questions get through. So Stephanie, if it's okay, maybe we'll ask maybe two questions, one each. So the first question that came in is, and it relates to your point about spending on older populations. It's pretty specific, but it has a broadening lens as well. If we means tested Social Security recipients who earn more than $100,000 a year, how much would that reduce Social Security debt? And then the person says, you know, assuming we could even pass it. So that sort of broadens out to the question that you were touching on several times, but about the sort of political economy of all this. You know, but if you were Queen, if you were in charge, you know, what kind of broad mix of things would you do, and how would you bring folks together to do that beyond?
Well, okay, so basically nothing that's responsible can really pass right now in this moment. So we can just put that aside and go to the if we were able to do what we thought we should do, and hopefully build a constituency where that becomes more possible over time. Means testing is at the top of my list. I look for things that balance being pro-growth. I think we have a real headwinds against us, even when the economy's recovered, in terms of economic growth because of the demographic challenges we face. And so I think you want to look at policies that are pro-growth. At the same time, for me, probably the biggest concern I have is the growth in income inequality in this country, and the fact that capitalism is not working for so many people, as shown by the high levels of income inequality, wealth inequality, and the low levels of mobility. That to me is a real sign that we need some fundamental changes and improvements to our economic system. There are many more things than just how the government works, but a more progressive government is part of what I see as the solution. That includes on the tax side. That also includes on the spending side. And again, you want to combine these with policies that are as good as possible for growing the economy. So on the tax side, just for instance, one of the best things you could do is cut out tax breaks for the well-off. End as many tax expenditures as possible for people who are earning more money. That's both pro-growth and progressive. On the spending side, means testing to me is the policy that makes the most sense. If something bad happens and you are vulnerable and need to collect benefits, I think it's really important that one knows Social Security will be there for them. But I think given that there is a dangerous funding imbalance in Social Security, we know we're going to have to make changes. There's only basically four things we can do: cut benefits, raise taxes, raise the retirement age, or I should say, because there'll be ands, improve the way we calculate the we measure inflation. That's more of a technical fix and certainly should be done. But those three, retirement age, spending, and taxes, I think you're going to end up having to do all of them. But I think when it comes to the spending cuts, don't touch those benefits for anybody who depends on the program, which means we should means test them for people who don't, and make it more of a system where it's insurance. And you will have a lot of people, including my father, who say, take your hands off my money. I paid into Social Security. And that is true, but there's more to the story than that. People also have tended, on average, to get more out of the system than they paid in, because as life expectancies have grown through the duration of the program from 62 to up into the late 70s and early 80s, people are collecting for much longer. And second, because we used the money that was in Social Security trust funds to finance the rest of government, while my father was paying in for his Social Security, he was also paying less for defense and healthcare and the environment and other policies. So there is a weaker link already in Social Security than I think people are aware of. Now, there's tons of pushback because people say if you weaken, if you means test, you'll unwind support for the program. I reject that. One of the biggest areas of growth, two of the biggest areas of growth in spending programs have been for Medicaid and for EITC. Those are both programs that are means tested. And so I do think that we will support programs that don't give retirement benefits to the very wealthy. The cutoff number is up for grabs. And you can't fix the entire system for means testing, not even close, but it's one of the chunks that could help there. I definitely think we should do that in Social Security. I already can see the hate mail coming to me on this. When you do a call-in C-SPAN show, that is about the least popular answer you can give.
Well, and I think the first letter is going to be from your father, and the next one will be from mine. So,
yeah. And I should say also, I'll put on my politician's hat, which I am nothing like, because I think we should do that for people who are retired right now. I think the people, the Warren Buffetts of the world, shouldn't get it. But no politician believes that. They think that can only kick in for people below a certain age. So they would grandfather everybody who's currently collecting benefits. And that should help create a whole constituency of people who aren't worried, aren't scared, despite the eagerness of the politicians to demagogue this issue. You know, no politician is going to take money away from somebody who's already collecting benefits. So this is how we're going to restructure it in the future. And to me, it makes by far the most sense to say, if you don't need it, let's use those resources somewhere else. Human capital, for instance.
Right. Well, and I think there's also this issue of a willingness to pay into a system where you see that the system itself is well run and effective. And I think that's probably an entirely different episode, but I think there's a linkage between people's willingness to pay in and a feeling that they're getting what they pay for.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I think we're going to be making a pivot from a social contract. Like I said, I think we need to redo our social contract because we have fixed the problems from last century and are ignoring the ones of the 21st century or the one we're in. But I think what we're really going to need is a social contract that's much more filled with insurances, because the risks are bigger and coming at us faster, more pronounced. And so we'll need a lot of things that help people get through each of the bumps they will face along their life, not just healthcare and retirement, which is basically what is centered around right now. There's going to be a lot more insurances we need to build in.
Right. So we got a lot of great questions. You've actually answered a lot of those questions as they came in. There's a nice final question here that I think is a good one for us to end on. And it's asking, if we keep our eye on first steps, what's the best first step to reform our budget process? So given everything that we've discussed here today, what would be in your perfect world a good first step to get us on the right path?
Gosh, thank you for the question to try to help me end on an optimistic note, which is something I'm not great on doing. I'll actually point out an optimistic effort, which is in the House, there are 60 members, 30 Rs, 30 Ds, who signed a letter saying, in the next economic package, could we include a mechanism that would say, once the economy is strong enough, we need to turn our efforts into dealing with the national debt. It doesn't specify what it is. It gives a bunch of examples, whether it would be a fiscal state of the nation or the Trust Act, which is something that Senator Romney has spearheaded with Senator Manchin. It's bipartisan, bicameral, that would help fix trust funds that are imbalanced. But I think having those 60 members of the House calling for something that, despite very different points of view, they all know we need to focus on that later. That's a good first step. And it also creates a group of politicians who care about this issue, which we need, again. I think we need budget process reforms where we have debt targets or something else that actually build in a constraint. And I think we're going to have to outsource some of these hard choices. Commissions have never succeeded particularly well, but they've actually succeeded better than regular order and most other efforts in trying to make these really hard choices. The best thing we could do is fix our political system, and I've got a long list of things from our project Fix Us to do there, but that's a whole nother show. But short of that happening, which isn't going to happen right away, I think we're going to have to outsource some of these hard choices to people for a while, so that you have a group of members who are appointed to say, here's maybe how we'll pay off our COVID debt, for instance. And they come back and you can decide whether to do it or not. And it gives politicians the ability to say, I would have done it much better myself, but okay, we'll agree on this. We have to help them find ways to compromise. It's never going to be a grassroots effort. This is not moving. This doesn't touch heartstrings. This is going to be about leadership. So I think also the most important thing we could have is, it's not the most important issue facing the country, but somebody who recognizes how it undergirds everything else and talks about the importance of being strong with a strong fiscal situation and starting to use that kind of as a rallying cry, and starts to be honest with voters that we have to make some hard choices on how we pay for things. So the political rhetoric is a piece of it, a commission is a piece of it, and a group of members who care about this issue are a piece of it.
Great. Well, listen, this is terrific. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but really appreciate those rich answers to too many questions. We need to do another show. In a minute, I'm going to introduce our next program and then our special segment, The Bottom Line. But first, let me just thank you, Maya. That was terrific. Thanks for joining us, for your insight, and we hope we can have you back.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun to be with both of you. I appreciate it.
Good. Thanks so much. So in a couple of weeks, August 24th, we'll have episode 7 with Kevin Hassett, who is now Vice President and Managing Director at the Lindsay Group, but was the Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Maya has provided you an overview of the U.S. indebtedness situation. The global indebtedness situation has grown dramatically over the last 10 years. This has left a number of countries vulnerable. To address the least vulnerable countries, the G20 in April of this year agreed to suspend debt relief, to provide cash flow relief to these countries going forward for the remainder of this calendar year. This policy has proven to allow 73 countries to be eligible. So far as we can tell, there's about 40 countries that have come forward for this debt relief, which adds up to about $5 billion of cash flow relief. So in that respect, it's been a success, but the success has been somewhat mixed, and it's been mixed for a couple of reasons. One is there is still a lot of opacity about what these countries owe to whom. So for instance, China is the largest bilateral official creditor to these countries, but we don't know exactly how they will participate. We do know that some of the other countries will participate through something called the Paris Club. Secondly, a lot of these countries have come forward and said they do not want debt relief from the private sector. So the private sector is the banks and bondholders. They have agreed that they would provide debt relief if it was asked for by the borrowing countries. But the borrowing countries have said that they don't want that. Why is that? That's because they are very worried about losing market access. So they don't want to have their credit rating taken down because that would suggest that they don't pay their debts. That would make it harder for them to get new debt in the future. So right now they are a little bit of stuck in that they're not asking for that cash flow relief, and so the private creditors aren't providing it. Going forward, it looks like the G20 is going to try to address some of these issues come the fall of this year and potentially try to extend the debt relief into 2021. I think that one thing that should also come about is a little more transparency. So we have a better idea of what do these countries owe and who do they owe it to. There are other technical issues around this, but I think that those are the key issues going forward. Thank you.